Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the nitty-gritty of your workouts. Are you training for strength? For bigger muscles hypertrophy?
Yeah.
Or maybe for strength endurance?
Yeah. It's a common question, isn't it? You finish a workout and think, okay, what did that actually do for me?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to unpack these three things. We want to look at the goals behind each, the specific ways you train for them, and, what changes are actually happening in your body.
Right. And we've looked at quite a bit of material scientific papers on muscle biology, how training adaptations work, even some practical insights from strength and conditioning coaches.
Great. So let's start with hypertrophy. That seems like the one many people associate with, well, lifting weights in general. What is it, basically?
Well, yeah, in simple terms, hypertrophy just means an increase in the size of your skeletal muscle. Your muscle cells actually get bigger.
Bigger cells, bigger muscles. Seems straightforward enough.
It does, but,
Yeah.
well, how they get bigger is where it gets interesting. There are different components to that growth.
Okay, so not just more muscle. What else is going on?
We often talk about two types, sort of. Myofibrillar hypertrophy and sarcoplasmic hypertrophy.
Myofibrillar sounds technical.
It just means growth of the myofibrils. Those are the actual contractile parts of the muscle, the actin and myosin proteins that do the pulling. So more of those means more contractile machinery.
Ah, okay, so that's the part that actually generates the force, makes you stronger.
Exactly. That type of growth is very directly linked to increases in strength potential. More engines in the muscle, basically.
Got it. So what about the other one? Sarcoplasmic.
Sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is more about the expansion of the non-contractile stuff around those fibers within the muscle cell.
Non-contractile stuff, like what?
Things like the fluid, the sarcoplasm itself, stored glycogen, which is your muscle fuel, various proteins involved in metabolism, maybe even some mitochondria.
And I feel like I've heard debates about this one, like how much does it really happen, and does it actually make you stronger or just bigger?
You're right on track there. There's definitely ongoing discussion and research about, the extent of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, how permanent it is, and its exact role.
So what's the current thinking?
Well, some research suggests it is a significant factor, particularly with higher volume training. Lots of sets, lots of reps. It might contribute more to the look of the muscle, the size, than necessarily to peak force production.
Like the difference between a bodybuilder and maybe a powerlifter or weightlifter.
That's a classic comparison, yeah. Both can have very large muscles, obviously, but the internal composition might differ. A bodybuilder might have a relatively greater proportion of that sarcoplasmic expansion, contributing to that full round look.
Whereas the weightlifter might have more density from the myofibrillar growth.
Potentially, yes. That's one way to conceptualize the difference in emphasis. But regardless of the exact mix, the main goal of hypertrophy training is that morphological change, you want bigger muscle fibers.
Okay, clear enough. Let's shift over to strength training then. The goal seems obvious, get stronger. But what's happening under the hood, especially when someone first starts out?
Right. The primary goal is definitely increasing that maximal force output. But, and this is key, the gains you see right at the beginning, like in the first, say, 4 to 8 weeks, they're not mostly from bigger muscles.
Oh, so if my muscles aren't bigger yet, how am I getting stronger?
It's mostly neural adaptations. Your nervous system gets better at controlling the muscles you already have.
Neural adaptations. Like my brain gets smarter about lifting.
Kind of, yeah. It's about improving how your brain recruits your muscle fibers. You learn to activate more of them simultaneously. That's motor unit recruitment.
Okay, getting more fibers involved.
And also rate coding. That's basically how fast your brain sends the signals telling those fibers to contract. Faster signals can mean more force.
Wow, so faster signals, more fibers working together.
Exactly, and better coordination between different muscles involved in the lift too. It all becomes more efficient. There was a study showing measurable increases in how fast motor units could fire, and it took less effort to recruit them after just 4 weeks.
So the brain's just becoming a better conductor for the muscle orchestra.
That's a great analogy, yes. But of course, over the longer term, to keep getting stronger, you do need those structural changes too.
Like the myofibrillar hypertrophy we were just talking about.
Precisely. Building more of those actual contractile proteins is essential for continued strength gains. And strength training also beefs up your connective tissues, tendons, ligaments, which helps you handle heavier loads safely.
Makes sense. You need the structure to support the force. What about energy systems for strength? It's usually short bursts, right?
Absolutely. Strength training adaptations are geared towards very brief, high-power outputs. So you rely heavily on the anaerobic systems.
Anaerobic, meaning without oxygen?
Right. Primarily the ATP PCR system for immediate energy, like the first few seconds of a heavy lift, and then anaerobic glycolysis for slightly longer intense efforts.
So how do the muscles adapt to fuel that?
They adapt by storing more ATP and phosphocreatine right there in the muscle, ready to go. You might also increase glycogen store slightly and improve the efficiency of that glycolytic pathway. It's all about having that quick, powerful energy on demand.
Got it. Quick fuel for quick hard work. Okay, third category. Strength endurance. This sounds like the opposite end of the spectrum.
It definitely focuses on a different quality, yeah. Strength endurance is about the muscle's ability to resist fatigue, either performing repeated contractions against a load for a long time or just holding a contraction.
So not about the single heaviest lift or the biggest muscle, but about keeping going.
Exactly. And the adaptations here are primarily metabolic. It's about making the muscle incredibly efficient at producing energy and clearing out waste products over time.
Metabolic. So changes inside the muscle related to energy.
Yes. Big increases in mitochondrial density, more of those cellular power plants. Also, increased capillarization.
More capillaries. Tiny blood vessels.
Right. Which means better delivery of oxygen and nutrients and better removal of metabolic byproducts like lactate that contribute to fatigue.
Okay. Better plumbing and more power plants.
You got it. Plus, increases in the activity of oxidative enzymes, the machinery within the mitochondria that uses oxygen to make energy. Things like citrate synthase, beta-hydroxy, OHAD. These make you better at using fat and carbs for fuel aerobically.
And does this also improve how the muscle handles that burning feeling, the acidity?
Yes, improved buffering capacity is another key adaptation. Your muscles get better at neutralizing those acidic byproducts, delaying fatigue.
Do the muscle fibers themselves change much with this kind of training?
There can be some shifts. You might see a tendency towards more type I fibers, which are naturally more fatigue resistant, and potentially some hypertrophy, but usually quite modest compared to dedicated hypertrophy training. It's more about supporting those metabolic upgrades.
And I assume the nervous system plays a role too in just keeping the muscle firing when it's getting tired.
Absolutely. Neural adaptations also help maintain muscle activation and coordination even as fatigue sets in.
Okay, this is really starting to paint a clear picture of three distinct goals. So how does this translate into practical training? The reps, sets, weight. How do those differ?
That's where it gets very practical, yeah. The variables load, reps, sets, rest are dialed in quite differently. Let's take strength first.
Okay, lifting heavy.
Right. You're typically using high loads, definitely above 85% of your 1 rep max, your 1 RM.
So weight, you can only lift a few times.
Exactly. Reps are low, usually in the 1 to 5 range per set. And because those efforts are so demanding neurally and muscularly, you need longer rest periods. Think 3 to 5 minutes, maybe even more between really heavy sets.
To fully recover and hit the next set hard.
Precisely. The main stimulus here is high mechanical tension driving those neural gains and eventually that myofibrillar growth.
Okay, strength. Heavy weight, low reps, long rest. What about hypertrophy, where most people probably train?
The traditional bodybuilding range, yeah, that typically involves moderate loads, say 60% to 85% of 1 RM.
So weight you can handle for more reps.
Right. But a rep range is usually moderate, classically 6 to 12 reps, sometimes narrowed to 8-12. You'll do multiple sets, often 3 to 6 per exercise.
And rest periods, shorter.
Generally shorter to moderate, yeah, maybe 30 seconds to 2 minutes. The idea is to generate both significant mechanical tension and metabolic stress.
Metabolic stress. That's the pump, the burn.
Kind of, yeah. It's the accumulation of byproducts from working the muscle intensely with relatively less rest. That combination of tension and metabolic stress is thought to be a potent stimulus for growth.
But wait, I've heard recently that you don't have to stick to that 6-12 rep range for hypertrophy. Is that true?
That's a really important point and reflects how our understanding has evolved. The research now strongly suggests hypertrophy can happen across a much wider range of loads.
Even lightweights.
Even quite light weights. Yeah, maybe down to 30% of 1 RM. And this is the crucial part, if you take those sets very close to, or all the way to, momentary muscular failure.
So pushing yourself really hard regardless of the weight.
Exactly. When you lift lighter weights to failure, you end up recruiting almost all your muscle fibers anyway, just like with heavy weights, and you generate significant metabolic stress. What seems really key for hypertrophy, maybe more than the specific rep range, is the overall training volume.
Volume meaning total work done, like sets times reps times weight, or just total sets.
Usually tracked as the total number of hard sets per muscle group per week. A common recommendation is aiming for at least 10 challenging sets per muscle group weekly. maybe more for some people, or muscle groups.
Okay, so effort and volume are king for hypertrophy, potentially more so than sticking religiously to 8-12 reps.
That seems to be the current consensus, yes. It gives you more flexibility in how you train.
Right. So what about strength endurance training parameters?
For strength endurance, you flip it again. You use lighter loads, generally below 60% of 1 RM. Okay. And the reps go way up, 15, 20, 25 reps per set, sometimes even more, depending on the goal. Rest periods are typically short, maybe 30, 60 seconds, sometimes even less.
To really push that fatigue resistance and metabolic conditioning.
Precisely. You're intentionally stressing those energy systems and the muscle's ability to handle fatigue.
This makes so much sense when you lay it out like that. What about the speed of the lift, the tempo? Does that matter?
Tempo can definitely play a role. It influences the time under tension, or TUT, for the muscle during a set.
Time under tension, how long the muscle is actually working.
Exactly. For hypertrophy, there's some evidence suggesting that controlling the tempo, especially having a slower eccentric phase, the lowering part of the lift, might be beneficial.
Slowing down the negative, why?
It increases the total time the muscle is under tension for a given number of reps, and the eccentric phase itself seems to be a potent stimulus for muscle damage and growth signaling. So controlling it might enhance the hypertrophic response.
Interesting. So tempo is another variable we can tweak. What about frequency, how often you train a muscle?
That's another area where things are maybe less rigid than we used to think. For hypertrophy, like we said, the total weekly volume seems most important. Whether you hit that volume target by training a muscle group twice a week or 3 times a week, it might come down more to personal preference, scheduling, and recovery.
As long as you get the total work in.
That seems to be the main driver. For pure strength, you need enough recovery between sessions hitting the same heavy lifts. For strength endurance, frequency might depend on the specific demands and how quickly you recover from that metabolically taxing work.
Okay, this gives a great framework for setting up training. Now, can we dive a bit deeper into the biology? What's actually happening at the cellular level for each of these? Let's circle back to hypertrophy.
Sure. At its core, hypertrophy is about achieving a state of positive net protein balance, meaning your muscle protein synthesis, building new protein, outpaces muscle protein breakdown over time.
Building more than you're breaking down. Makes sense. What triggers that building process?
The primary trigger is mechanical tension, that force generated during resistance training. Your muscle cells have mechanosensors that detect this load.
Sensors for stretch or force.
Exactly. And detecting that tension initiates signaling cascades within the cell. A really key pathway involved is the mTOR pathway, specifically mTORC1.
Ah, yes, MTO. You hear that mentioned a lot with muscle growth.
Rightly so. It's like a master regulator. It integrates signals from mechanical load, growth factors like IGF-1, amino acid availability, especially leucine, and cellular energy status. When activated, mTORC1 ramps up protein synthesis machinery, including making more ribosomes, which are the factories that build proteins.
So lifting weights flips the mTOR switch, telling the muscle to build more protein.
That's a good way to put it. Resistance training is a powerful activator.
What about those satellite cells you mentioned briefly? Where do they fit in?
Satellite cells are muscle stem cells sitting on the outside of muscle fibers. Heavy training can activate them. They can then multiply, and some confuse with the existing muscle fiber, donating their nucleus.
Why donate a nucleus?
The thinking is that a muscle fiber's nucleus can only manage a certain amount of cytoplasm, a certain volume of the cell. As the fiber grows really big, it might need more nuclei to manage that larger domain and sustain further growth. So satellite cells might be more crucial for long-term significant hypertrophy or for repair after damage.
But growth can happen without them, at least initially.
Yes, studies suggest hypertrophy can occur without satellite cell fusion, especially in the earlier stages. So they're important, likely essential for reaching your maximum potential, but maybe not required for all growth.
And what about metabolic stress? We talked about it as a stimulus for hypertrophy training, but how does it biologically contribute to growth?
That's still debated a bit more than mechanical tension, but the idea is that the accumulation of metabolites, lactate, hydrogen ions, etc., during intense sets, especially with shorter rest, might contribute in a few ways.
How so?
One thought is it increases motor unit recruitment. As some fibers fatigue due to the metabolic environment, your body has to recruit more higher threshold fibers to keep the set going, thus stimulating more fibers overall.
Okay, so it helps maximize fiber activation.
Possibly. Another idea involves cell swelling, or the pump. The accumulation of fluid and metabolites can cause the muscle cell to swell, and this swelling itself might be perceived as a threat to the cell's integrity, triggering anabolic signaling pathways as a response.
Interesting. So the pump might actually do something beyond just feeling good.
It's plausible it plays a role, yeah.
Yeah.
And underpinning all of this, of course, are changes in gene expression, turning on the genes needed to build more muscle-specific proteins like actin and myosin.
Okay, a complex interplay of tension, signaling, maybe stress, and gene activity for hypertrophy. What about the biological drivers for strength again? You said neural first.
Exactly. The initial strength gains are dominated by the nervous system learning to use the existing muscle more effectively. That increased motor unit recruitment, getting more fibers to contract at once. The increased rate coding, making those fibers fire faster and more frequently.
Right, the brain getting better at it.
Yes, and that study we mentioned earlier showed concrete evidence of this. Motor neurons firing faster and being easier to activate after just a few weeks of strength training, that's a direct neural adaptation leading to more force.
And then later, the muscle growth adds to that potential.
Correct. Myofibrillar hypertrophy increases the force-generating capacity, and stronger connective tissues provide better force transmission.
Makes sense. And for strength endurance, biologically, you mentioned mitochondria.
Yeah, the adaptations are heavily metabolic. A huge one is mitochondrial biogenesis, creating more mitochondria. More power plants mean a much greater capacity for aerobic energy production using oxygen.
Which delays fatigue during sustained effort.
Precisely. And the increased capillary density means better oxygen delivery to those mitochondria and better waste removal. The increased activity of oxidative enzymes like citrate synthase and pol-ADD means the mitochondria are more efficient at processing fuels aerobically.
So more power plants, better fuel delivery and waste removal, and more efficient engines within the power plants.
That's a perfect summary. It all leads to a muscle that's much better equipped to sustain contractions and resist fatigue.
This is fascinating stuff. Now, are there potential downsides or conflicts if someone tries to train for, say, strength and endurance at the same time? I've heard about an interference effect.
Yes, that's a well-documented phenomenon, particularly when combining high-volume endurance training with strength or hypertrophy training.
Interference, meaning one type of training can blunt the results of the other.
Essentially, yes. High amounts of endurance exercise can sometimes compromise gains in maximal strength, power, and muscle size, especially in the same muscles being used for both activities, often the legs.
Why does that happen? What's the mechanism?
There are a few theories. One prominent one involves conflicting signaling pathways. Endurance exercise strongly activates a pathway involving AMPK, which senses energy stress. AMPK activation can actually inhibit the mTORC1 pathway.
The main pathway for muscle growth we just talked about.
Exactly. So the signal from endurance training might effectively put the brakes on the muscle-building signal from resistance training, especially if they're done too close together or if the endurance volume is very high.
Wow, so they're sending competing signals inside the muscle cell.
That seems to be part of it. There's also just cumulative fatigue. If you do a long, hard run, you're likely going to be too tired to perform optimally in a subsequent heavy squat session, reducing the quality of the strength stimulus.
Makes sense. So concurrent training needs careful planning.
Definitely. It's not impossible, but managing volume, intensity, nutrition, and the timing of sessions becomes more critical to minimize that interference.
What about those different types of hypertrophy, myofibrillar versus sarcoplasmic? Does that distinction matter for combining goals?
It could, yeah. If a lot of your size gains are sarcoplasmic, that fluid and glycogen expansion might not directly translate to significantly more strength in the way myofibrillar growth does. Conversely, adaptations geared towards endurance, like high mitochondrial density, might slightly compromise peak power output compared to a muscle purely adapted for strength.
So the type of adaptation matters too. And just to reiterate something you mentioned earlier, because I think it's important for hypertrophy, we shouldn't be totally fixated on that 6-12 rep range anymore.
Right. It's a useful guideline, and it often works well because it balances tension and metabolic stress. But the key takeaway from recent science is that effort is paramount. Taking sets close to failure, whether with moderate weight for 10 reps or lighter weight for 25 reps, seems to be a powerful stimulus for growth, provided the overall weekly volume is sufficient.
Good reminder, flexibility is key. One last thing, muscle soreness. We all get it. Is it actually necessary or even a good sign for muscle growth?
DOMS delayed onset muscle soreness. It definitely happens, especially when you start a new program or push intensity. but it's not necessarily a reliable indicator of muscle growth.
Oh,
Well, soreness is often linked to muscle damage. While some level of damage might initiate repair and growth processes, especially early on, excessive damage isn't needed and might even hinder recovery and growth. Your body adapts quite quickly, and you tend to get less sore over time with the same workout, even while still making progress.
so chasing extreme soreness isn't the goal.
No, not really. The muscle protein synthesis response shifts more towards building new tissue rather than just repairing damage as you get more accustomed to training. Consistent progressive overload and sufficient volume are better long-term indicators than how sore you feel.
Okay, this has been incredibly insightful. So, boiling it all down, what are the main practical takeaways for someone listening right now trying to figure out their own training?
I think the absolute biggest takeaway is clarity on your primary goal. What do you most want to achieve right now? Is getting bigger, getting stronger, or improving endurance?
Because that primary goal dictates the training approach.
Exactly. Your choice of load, reps, sets, rest periods, all those variables we discussed should directly reflect that number one priority. If you're trying to maximize strength, training mostly in the 15-20 rep range isn't the most efficient way.
And vice versa, if you want endurance, lifting super heavy for sets of 3 isn't the main focus.
Precisely. Align your training with your goal.
And it's not always simple. People respond differently.
Right. Absolutely. These are general principles based on research, but individual responses vary. Genetics, nutrition, sleep, stress levels, they all play a role. So pay attention to your own body, track your progress, see what works best for you.
So be intentional, be observant, and adjust as needed.
That's the key. And also remember, you don't have to be a purist. Most people benefit from a mix. You can build strength, size, and endurance within a well-rounded program.
But be mindful of that interference effect if you're pushing hard on multiple fronts simultaneously.
Exactly. Understand the trade-offs. If you're training for a marathon, your powerlifting total might take a temporary hit, and that's okay if the marathon is the priority. It's about managing expectations and programming smartly.
This has been fantastic. Just to hammer it home one last time, can you give us a super quick summary of the main distinction for each?
Sure. Strength training. Goal is max force. Primary adaptations are neural first, then myofibrillar hypertrophy. Use heavy loads, low reps, long rest.
Got it. Hypertrophy.
Goal is increased muscle size. Primary adaptation is morphological growth, myofibrillar and maybe sarcoplasmic, driven by mechanical tension and metabolic stress. Moderate loads reps traditionally, but wider range possible if effort and volume are high. Moderate rest.
Okay. And strength endurance.
Goal is fatigue resistance. Primary adaptations are metabolic, mitochondria, capillaries, enzymes. Use lighter loads, high reps, short rest.
Perfect. So for everyone listening, now that you've got this deeper understanding, the real question is, looking at your current training, what are you really training for? And is it aligned with what you truly want to achieve?
It's definitely food for thought. Hopefully this helps you refine your approach and get even better results.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for breaking all that down. And thank you all for joining us on the deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and we'll catch you next time.